of that particular situation. I've referenced this guy several times. We're going to be in Psalm 40 to start with. That's where we ended up last week. But I've referenced this guy several times, so I just wanted to show you, this is the book that this idea kind of came from, by a guy named Walter Brueggemann. I'll just tell you, here's the disclaimer. I do not agree with much of what this guy teaches. But he's an Old Testament scholar. And with a lot of the Old Testament, it's really hard to mess it up. I mean, it's just kind of an account of what happens. But his approach with this thing with the Psalms to me has been very interesting. So that's the book. You could Google this guy's name, and there's all kinds of different stuff that you could find about this particular idea. But like I said, it's just a different way of kind of breaking the Psalms up into different categories. And like I said, to me, it's really worked out well, because it seems like something we can all relate to, because we all have these good moments, not so great, if not horrible moments. But then if we stay focused, stay faithful, doing what God needs us to do, we can see as God pulls us out of those times of despair. Like I said, we're in Psalm 40, or we were in Psalm 40 as we closed out last week. Psalm 40 is an interesting example of these Psalms of new orientation, because it starts out, it's very obvious. It's pretty clear that you can see it's a two-part psalm, that there is verses 1 through 10 talk about God's deliverance, how the psalmist was taken out of the pit. And then the middle part of it, or the middle to the end of it, is kind of his reflection on here's how I felt while I was in that pit. So it's kind of a reverse of how some of these work. We'll kind of bounce back through this and then wrap up with this psalm and end up with one more in just a minute. I asked Steve Jones if he would to lead us in a word of prayer, and then we'll proceed. Amen. Okay, if you look just kind of briefly down through Psalm 40, you can see the first few verses, you can see the verbs. And the psalmist is talking about how God acted, how God acted in his life. That when he was in this bad place, God, you can see that the different words, lifted, set my feet, gave me a firm place. God did something on the psalmist's behalf. And that's the point of these type psalms. To remember that when we come out of these bad situations, it's God who gets us out. Look at verses 6 through 8. We'll kind of pick up right there. Well, I just lied. Verse 4 and 5. Verse 4 says, blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust. What does just that first phrase remind you of? Blessed is the man... What? Matthew 5, somebody said? Psalm 1. Blessed is the man his feet are planted by the river, or whatever it says. We're not going to go look at it, but it's kind of that same idea, the blessings of being connected to God. It's teaching language. I mean, it's a reminder that in order for us to have this hope of being pulled out of those pits, stay connected with God. Now, look at 6 through 8. That's where I wanted to pick up. And we talked about this some last week too. In sacrifice and offering you have not delighted, but you have given me an open ear. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. Then I said, behold, I have come, and in the scroll of the book it is written of me. I delight to do your will, O my God. Your law is within my heart. this is that idea that we see throughout so many of these Psalms, so many of this idea. And again, I think we talked about this a little bit last week, that Psalm 40 is a psalm of David. This sounds a lot like several parts of Psalm 119, which isn't attributed to David, but seems like it very well could be David's. Because it's that idea that just the acts of sacrifice and offering God doesn't want, but what he wants is someone who is open to his word, open to his will. And you can see in those verses this dedication, this devotion to God's law and to God's word. Again, all in the context of this is how I came out of the bad place that I was in. And then verses 9 and 10, if you continue on there, he says, I have told the glad news of deliverance in the great congregation. Behold, I have not restrained my lips. As you know, O Lord, I have not hidden your deliverance within my heart. I have spoken of your faithfulness and of your salvation. I have not concealed your steadfast love and your faithfulness from the great congregation. He's saying, I shared this with everybody. I wanted people to know that it was God who got me out of this place. So these first 10 verses are a celebration of the fact that he's out of this bad place. He's out of this despair that he was in. But then we see the transition in verse 11, which is, like I said, it's kind of unusual. He says, as for you, O Lord, you will not restrain your mercy from me. Your steadfast love and your faithfulness will ever preserve me. For evils have encompassed me beyond number. My iniquities have overtaken me, and I cannot see. And we won't read down through the rest of it, but you can see it begins to sound like the complaint section of those lament psalms. And it's almost as if, and again, this is something that we do. Even when you've gotten through a bad situation, even when a relationship has improved or a health situation has improved, we can talk about it, and say, things are better, I feel better. But then we can sometimes start to go, man, I was really down then. I was really upset. Things weren't going well. I was really had issues with this and this. Because that's what we do. So this to me seems very real of David to kind of reflect on how good it is that he's out of that place, but then kind of start going, man, it was really terrible though. It was really, this is how I felt. And then look at 14 through 16. Let those be put to shame and disappointed altogether who seek to snatch away my life. Again, it kind of sounds like those imprecatory psalms to go and take care of my enemies. Let those be turned back and brought to dishonor who delight in my hurt. Let those be appalled because of their shame who say to me, aha, aha. But may all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. May those who love your salvation say continually, great is the Lord. So even though he has that moment of, you can almost think of it as reflection on how bad things were, he comes again. And that's what makes this the new orientation psalm, because at the beginning of it, he's thankful and rejoicing that things are better, kind of dips down back into things were really terrible, but then he ends with this idea that let all those who know your salvation say, great is the Lord. So he closes even with the reminder that what gets us out of those bad places is our relationship with God. What we see in this psalm is David vividly remembering the fact that he was in a bad place. And, David has more than one of these type psalms. David's been in some bad, starting with the Psalm 51 that he writes after the sin with Bathsheba. But then there's also Psalms that seem to be right after, some of the problems with his children, some of the places where he was in despair. But we see the fact that David connects that he's not there anymore with his relationship with God, that God's the only one who's going to pull him out of that. And that's so much, that to me is part of why we think of, or we see that David is referred to as a man after God's own heart. That David has a heart of staying focused on God, staying focused on the goodness that God provides. So let me ask you this. Have you ever, and you don't have to share specifics or just say yes or no if you have or haven't. Have you ever been in a bad place in your life and kind of written down how things are going, and then where you came out of that? I mean, I don't know if any of you journal. I'm an aspiring journalist. By that I mean someone who writes a journal. And I do it sometimes pretty consistently, and then I go for weeks, and I'm like, oh yeah, I wrote like 4 sentences this month. But one thing I've been really consistent about is just keeping a prayer journal. And when we have the special needs, I'll write down what the deal is with somebody and and it's interesting to look back and go, here's what happened with that person. Here's how we thought things were really bad, and this improvement was made, or maybe but then you look and see what happened in their family or whatever. And it's the same way with this kind of writing that David records for us to look back on centuries later and go, yeah, there's going to be some times where things are really gross, but if I stay connected with God, God's going to be the one who's going to pull me out of that. It's kind of that hindsight thing, the idea of hindsight being 20/20, where in this case, we get to use David's hindsight, where we can look back and see how he came through all of that. Any thoughts on Psalm 40? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, what April's saying is sometimes we find ourselves where we get out of these pits and we forget to thank God and we forget to praise God. That's a good point, because that's what David says. He goes, I'm not going to hesitate to share with everybody that you're the one who got me out of this. So that in and of itself is a good example. That's a good point. Psalm 30 and 40, the two we've just looked at, both are more of that thanksgiving for being out of the bad place. Thanksgiving that God got me here. When I started this portion a couple weeks ago or last week, whenever it was, we said that, or what I said I was going to do was talk about that thanksgiving, but then also confidence. And that's kind of where I thought you might be going with your comment, that sometimes when we get out of those pits, we need to be reminded that if it happens again, because it very well might, we have a helper, that we have God who is going to be there for us. And I figured there's no better way to close a class on the Psalms than talk about the 23rd Psalm. You just almost can't dodge it. Not like you'd want to dodge the 23rd Psalm. But in this idea of the Psalms of new orientation, and I have to say, I never really thought of this like this before. I've always kind of thought of this as more or less a praise psalm. But when you think about some of the things that he describes, the valley of the shadow of death, David's been in some rough places. You think about the things that he's done. Psalm, he expresses confidence in God. And it's interesting to look at it in this light. This guy, Walter Brueggemann, this is his quote about his own analysis in one of his books about the 23rd Psalm. He starts like this: "It's almost pretentious to comment on this psalm. The grip it has on biblical spirituality is deep and genuine. It is such a simple statement that it can bear its own witness without comment." And so maybe it is a little pretentious, but if you're writing a book, you're writing a book, I guess. But it is. It's one of the most, if not probably the most well-known psalm. It's one of the most well-known passages in the Bible. If you ask people on the street, for the most part, you might be able to get close to this anyway. But the image that what we get from this, when we think about that valley of the shadow of death, and we think about, as David writes this, the comfort he's showing, the confidence he's showing in God as shepherd. And then the second part of it, which again, I never really kind of thought about it as two distinct parts, but the Lord is his shepherd at the beginning, and at the end he presents God as hosting a great banquet, as God as his host and his provider. So it's kind of a cool way to look at it. So as we look at Psalm 23, I think, let's just read it. I mean, this of all the Psalms, we know this one probably the best, but let's read it anyway. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And again, you see with that phrase, even he restores my soul. He's kind of, there's that hint of there was a place where things weren't good. He's restored me to a better place. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So the first image is, of course, the one that is probably the most well-known, this picture of shepherd. Super contemporary image in David's day, very personal to David because that's what he did, you know. But what is interesting about this idea is in the ancient Near East, in the time David wrote this, who else were referred to as shepherds? Ezekiel 34. You think about Jeremiah 23. Leaders of people, kings, were called shepherds. So the idea of the Lord is my shepherd, the immediate image obviously is the shepherd. But in David's day, there would have also been the connotation of the leader of everything, the ruler of people. He's the one who is in charge of everything in my life. There'd be political type ramifications for it. But it's a reference to, for the kings, when kings are called this, or leaders, like I said in Ezekiel 34, the leaders, the elders of the people are called shepherds, and they're not doing a good job. But it's the idea that they're the ones who have watch over the people. So when he says, the Lord is my shepherd, you can think, of course, just the sheep and the shepherd, but you can also think of the one who manages the people, the one who is in charge of everything about the people. It's in Jeremiah 23 and Ezekiel 34, it's a reference God uses to the leaders of the people being in charge of not only the spiritual well-being, but the physical well-being. He says, you haven't done your job. So when David uses the idea, the Lord is my shepherd, it's a bigger picture image than I think sometimes that we think. It's a very confirming statement that I don't have any other leader, I don't have any other guide, the Lord is my shepherd. I don't need anybody else. So when he says, I shall not want, the next statement, that's a very absolute statement. When he says that, he's saying, I don't need anything else. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I mean, the psalm could end right there. Move on to the next one. But he's saying, I have absolute trust, I have absolute confidence in my God. And then even in that idea where he says, he leads me beside still waters, he restores my soul. That's that reminder of the confidence that God's going to take me to places that are good for me. God's going to, if something does go wrong, it's God who's going to get me back in the right place. The idea of restoring my soul because he is my shepherd, my leader of everything. And because of that, there is no wanting. There's nothing missing in his life. And when you look through this, I mean, this is kind of the exegetical preacher way of looking at things. But he talks about the four things that God does as a shepherd. Makes me lie down in green pastures. What does that tell us? I mean, just thinking sheep and shepherd. What image does that provide for you? Secure? Provision? Exactly. That he's going to take us to a place that because he puts us there, it's a place that he's confident in. It's a place where we're going to have what we need supplied. Leads me beside still waters. And I don't remember if it was Richard that was talking about this or one of our guests recently or what it was, but what's significant about a sheep being near still waters? What's that? Yeah, they don't like running water and they don't have the sense to stay away from it. So they'll just go and they're gone. They don't swim very well, yeah. So again, it's the idea of security. It's the idea of God's going to put us in a place that is good for us, that isn't going to cause us harm, if we have the sense to stay there like some sheep don't. Again, yeah, it's beautiful, it's healthy, it's, like I said, it's good for us. It's a place we need to be. Then restores my soul, that idea of if things do go wrong, my shepherd is going to be the one who's going to restore me. And then he says he guides me in the right paths, guide me in paths of righteousness. When we think of guides me in paths of righteousness, it immediately becomes a spiritual thinking, at least for me. But if we think of a shepherd leading his sheep in the right paths, what is that image? I mean, what do you see from that? Jesus leading us, yeah, a bigger picture, yeah, from direction, discipline. And that's the thing that I think is direction, discipline, that sheep can kind of go, I'm going this way. And that's what, the rod and the staff, the shepherd gets them back in line, keeps them going the right way. So this whole image of sheep and shepherd show that God provides. That God provides not just, I mean, in the sheep-shepherd idea, not just sustenance and food, but it provides well-being, provides comfort, provides security. And these seem to be the images that David's trying to get across, that have confidence in God, have a faith, have a trust in God, that even if you find yourself in the lowest place, that it's God who's going to restore your soul. It's God who's going to be the one who's going to take care of all you need to get out of that. And then verse 4, when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Now, you've probably heard all kinds of different explanations and descriptions of this, but I mean, it's protection, but then it's also discipline. I mean, that's what the shepherd uses, the hook end of the shepherd's staff. Is that what it's called? Is it a crook end? Did I just make up some words right there? Okay, yeah, the crooked, not crooked, but crook end. Because if a sheep starts to go off, just kind of grab it around the neck or whatever and scoot it back into line, stay with everybody else. So it's interesting to think of this in this idea of coming back to a right relationship with God. Coming back to where you're on a better spiritual footing with God. To think of that staff as a comfort. Because we don't like discipline. We don't like to be corrected and fixed and pushed back into line. But you can see the image here of, that's what I need and I know it. I need that sometimes. And sometimes I'm not ready for it. Sometimes I think I know my own path, but sometimes I need to be yanked back into line. And David describes that as a comfort in this idea of God taking care of everything. And then it's interesting too in verse 4, in verses 1 through 3, he's talking about God, or he's talking about the shepherd. He leads me this way. He leads me. He does this for me. But look at verse 4. How does it change in verse 4? What's that? He gets personal. It goes from talking about God to talking to God. Like I said, I don't think I've ever noticed that before for some reason. But I just think that's really cool that he's saying that he leads me beside still water. He restores my soul. And then he says, God, you're the comfort. Your staff, your discipline, your protection is what gives me comfort. I don't know, for some reason, I thought that was really cool, especially in this idea of kind of getting things back reoriented, refocused on the relationship with God. Now, that is a comforting image. That's a powerful image. But it's an image that also doesn't mean that we're not going to have dangers we have to face. It doesn't mean that we're not going to have challenges and difficulties, and as dumb sheep, we're not going to kind of roam off the path once in a while. But what it does mean is that those things can't hurt us as long as we stay connected to God. Now, physically, mentally, emotionally, we get it. Not spiritually. Emotionally, physically, all that other stuff, those things can hurt us. Health problems can hurt us. Family problems can hurt us. But spiritually, we can stay connected to God. That God is the one who will restore us back into that right place. That God will get us out of those situations that are threatening to us. And that really is a comforting image. Okay, any thoughts on those first 4 verses? Like I said, this is probably one of the most talked about section of Scripture in the world, but to me it's kind of a neat picture. Yeah. George said the valley of the shadow of death, you can kind of see that as finding yourself in sin, and that God's the one who will get you through even that valley, that bad place, and get you back again on the right path. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, when Nolan said that he could have started with the Lord is the shepherd. But he starts with the personal idea even, that the Lord is my shepherd, that I have this connection with God. Yeah, what Stan said, you can make a connection with this with Matthew 6:33. You seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things that he's been talking about, life stuff, clothes and shelter and all that will be taken care of because the Lord is your shepherd. And again, it doesn't mean you're not ever going to have bad times. You might sometimes be in want. But spiritually, in a connection with God, you stay in that relationship with God, you won't be in, at least not in spiritual want. And I mean, you look at David. David is a guy that, he says, I shall not want. David was in some desperate times. That doesn't mean David was never hungry, never had to go into the temple and eat the showbread because he had to do that. But he's saying, big picture, I have everything I need with the Lord as my shepherd. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just that idea that when one sheep, and that kind of goes back to the parable of the 99, that when one wanders off, the shepherd isn't going to say, no, I'm too busy to go after that one sheep. He'll go get the one sheep if he has to, and that's the image of God. Steve. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Now, what Steve's saying is that image of the valley of shadow of death is a reminder that it's kind of John 10:10, that Christ came to give us life and a life that is abundant, that we don't have to fear, even fearing death. That's one of the other things that this Brueggemann guy wrote about Psalm 23. I don't remember the quote exactly, but in essence, he was saying, why is the 23rd Psalm turned into the funeral psalm? Because he talks about not fearing death, he said, well, why isn't this about, living life and having confidence that God will get us through everything in life, not just at that moment of the end of life? Because, really, that's not even what he's saying. Because he said, God gets me through that. And, if you're reading that at a funeral, that's not what happened. But the idea is it's a confidence that God gets us through life. So the first 4 verses is the shepherd picture. And again, I have to admit, I don't know if I ever really caught this transition, but the last part, he shifts into this idea as God as the host. That God is now saying, okay, I've taken care of you. And again, this kind of has the idea with the idea of the shepherd as a king. This is kind of like the king's banquet. Come on in here, sit down, have a seat. I'm hosting things now. Look what he says. Look at this idea. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Now, again, this was an idea that I'm borrowing from somebody else, but I never really caught that verse. If you're invited to a table in the presence of your enemies, where are your enemies? I mean, yeah, probably not at the same table you're at. I mean, and the guy that I read from this, said that this comes about as close to gloating as you can get. That, yeah, I'm at the table of the king in the presence of my, so it's like they're at the windows going, hey, what are they having in there? I mean, it's that idea that God has taken care of me. He's taken me from wherever wherever the low place was for David, one of his many, that he says he's restored my soul. He's led me in the right paths. And now he prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies. And think about all the number of times that David has talked to God. I mean, we just saw it in Psalm 40. Take care of those enemies who say, aha, aha, at me, who point at me and ridicule me. Now I'm sitting at a table and they're looking in the window. Is that you? Yeah. Yeah. Dan said you can kind of make the connection to Joseph, where he's eating in a place where his brothers can't, they just have to sit and watch him eat. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of David's enemies were right close. I mean, in the same house even. Yes, he had problems with his own sons. Now, he's just said, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. So I'm sitting at this table, my enemies are watching, and like I said, this is the idea of the gloating a little bit. But then he says, you anoint my head with oil. What does that mean? Yeah, there's health benefits, but I think in this situation, at being at the king's table, what's the connotation there? It's an honor. He's saying, I'm sitting at the table in front of my enemies, and you, the good shepherd, the shepherd, God, the king, you anoint my head with oil. And he's like, look where I am. I mean, like I never really thought about this like this, but I mean, it's him saying, I'm sitting at this table that you prepared, the shepherd, you prepared, then you anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. I've got more than I could ever need. So that goes back to the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Because look how much he's going to give me. Look, my cup's going to overflow. Somebody else had a hand up. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, what Steve's saying is that this seems like David kind of saying, I found my peace with God. And, I've heard a lot of people talk about this 23rd Psalm as maybe a psalm that David wrote when he was still a shepherd. And we don't know time and some of this stuff, but I kind of think that maybe this is a looking back at life kind of a deal for David. And then he says, surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. Why? Because of what the shepherd has done for him. Now, what's interesting, and I don't know if any translations do this, but there's a footnote, not in this ESV, but in some ESVs, and I've seen it other places, that the word follow me could be the word, or maybe even should be the word pursue, that surely goodness and mercy will pursue me all the days of my life. And it's like, yeah, that's not that big a difference. Pursue and follow, it's the same word. But is it the same word? I mean, if I'm being followed, I'm kind of going, if I'm being pursued, I'm not looking back. I'm just going that way. I mean, it's a stronger term, but he's saying because of how good the shepherd is to me, because I don't want, because he puts me at this table and anoints my head, goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. And when he says that idea, oh, yes, sir. So the Holman Christian Standard does use the word pursue. I didn't even think of that. I've got one like this far from my face in my office. I should have checked it. But yeah, so when he said, and I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever, this is, again, one of those statements that we kind of make it to be a end of life type thing, that he's looking at heaven. But it seems maybe that what he's talking about is right now, that I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever, that I know because the Lord is my shepherd, he will always take care of me. Even when I have the bad spots, even when I have the rough spots, even if I cause them myself, if I turn back to him and I stay with him and renew my focus, I can have this new orientation where I can be back at the king's table, sitting with the shepherd and having him take care of my needs, take care of my well-being. This is another quote, and we'll wrap up with this one. Psalm 23 knows that evil is present in the world, but it is not feared. Confidence in God is the source of our new orientation. And I think Psalm 23 is in that light is a great psalm about confidence in God, that we don't have to worry about him leaving us. Because again, you think of all the different things about shepherds. Shepherds don't ever, a good shepherd doesn't ever just run off and leave their flock. The sheep roam off. But the shepherd comes and gets them. The shepherd is always there to take care of them. So that is the idea then of this different orientation. Like I said, I hope this has been an interesting look for you. To me, this has been one of my favorite studies I've done in quite a while, that just looking at it from a different perspective. Any other thoughts or comments? Yeah, it can be, yeah. The anointing the head with oil can have health benefits. Like James talks about that if any of you sick, let the elders come anoint him. I think in this context it's more of the honoring, but the idea is there. Anything else? Yeah, she said it's interesting that it says he makes me lie down in green pastures, because sometimes we have to be told it's time to stop. This is where we're staying. Okay, so for the last class of the quarter, we'll stop before the bell rings. Not too bad. Free time.